Hey everybody, and welcome to this kitchen renovation. I've got a really exciting backsplash planned with this very trendy elongated hexagon pattern with a handmade tile look. It costs about $6.50 a square foot, not bad. And the tiles are attached in a relatively interesting way. They've got these tabs of glue or adhesive holding the tiles together rather than a mesh like you'll see a lot of times. Now I've already done some prep work. First, I took down the old drywall that was just too damaged for me to want to reuse. I replaced that with some new 1/2-inch drywall that I cut out using a sharp utility knife. I'm sure some people might say that it's not necessary to replace that drywall, but this task only took an hour or two to do, and it's going to give us a great canvas to tile on. In this open gap where my oven is going to be, I installed an MDF ledger board that I made sure was really level and even across those two countertops. I took a minute to lay down some masking paper and tape around all of my new quartz countertops, that way nothing gets scratched or damaged during our installation, and then I applied tape and a coat of mud to all of our drywall seams. This will help prevent any future shifting or cracking in the tile, and I sanded all the high points with 120 grit sandpaper once it had dried. At first, I measured to find the center of the wall. That's where I figured the seam of our backsplash should be.
But upon second thought, I decided it would actually look better centered on the microwave in the stove. So I used a level to mark a vertical and a horizontal reference line across my drywall.
The span that we're covering is 17 3/4 of an inch. So it's tall enough that we're gonna need 2 sheets of backsplash. And it looks like if I cut a straight line at the bottom of this sheet, that cut will be just about centered with the top of our tiles, making things look really symmetrical. I think that'll give us the least waste.
Here I'm applying painter's tape where I'm gonna make my cut. This will help prevent any chip out and the tiles from shifting. I'm using a pretty basic 7-inch wet tile saw from Harbor Freight. It cost about $300 and I would say it was well worth the investment. You load up the bottom with water into a reservoir and then that keeps your blade wet so that the tile and your blade stays cool while cutting. And I would highly recommend either renting or buying a tile saw with a sliding table for mosaic tiles. On a cheaper saw with a fixed table, these tiles can bunch up and it's hard to make a straight line. After the test cut was complete, I put my tiles in place and I noticed they were going to end up being a little bit higher than that initial reference line that I made. So I just quickly made a new one about 1/4 of an inch up. And then I batch cut all of my tiles for the bottom row. In total, I cut 15 of these. After these sheets of tile were cut, I felt like I had a good lead and it was time to mix up some thin set mortar. And I'm using white thin set because I'm coming back with a very light gray grout and I don't want a darker gray mortar to bleed into that grout color. Thin set is pretty interesting because you mix it to the consistency that you want, then you let it set for about 5 or 10 minutes and then reincorporate it.
So it's game time, and I'm gonna be using a 1/4-inch square notch trowel. That should be good for the tile I'm using. If I was installing anything smaller, I would use a V-notch trowel. And I'm using these wedge spacers on the bottom to get my tile sheet to the line. One down.
Once you get going, you can put down enough thin set to apply like 6 or 9 sheets of tile. But while I was getting started, I just applied enough mortar for one at a time in case I needed to make any adjustments to my tile.
And I'm using traditional 1/8-inch spacers in between each sheet.
Whatever the spacing of the tile in your sheet is what you want spacing each sheet apart.
And we'll give it a wiggle, make sure it sets in.
I give the tiles a good press, but I don't want a lot of squeeze out.
We're really off to a great start. Those first 3 sheets look perfect. But my mortar was a little bit too thin. You can see that it's drooping here and it's not quite as rigid as it should be. I just wanted to point this out in case you noticed the same.
I thought the mortar would stiffen up a little bit more than it did in those 5 to 10 minutes before I remixed it, but it didn't, so watch out for that. Now measuring for an outlet like this is pretty simple. You want to incorporate the 1/8-inch gap anywhere that you're measuring, but you just want to measure off of any good reference point you've got, like the tiles you've already put down or the countertop. Then you can come back with an angle grinder and a diamond blade, just like what's on the tile saw, and cut out where you've marked. And you'll notice once again, I used painter's tape where I'm cutting to prevent cracking. And when you're doing this, you want the margins of your tiles to be as tight to that electrical box as possible without covering the screw holes that are used to screw your outlets into the electrical box. As I approached the corner, it was kind of standard operating procedure with these last full sheets. and then I measured the distance from the wall, and then I marked that on one of my sheets of tile and cut that to width on my tile saw. Then I made a matching cut on the next sheet so that the grout line is basically continuous in that corner. I'll save tiling all the way to the edge of that wall until we cut our trim. So now we'll move to putting down some custom cut tile underneath the windowsill. I needed to cut the hexagons into long rectangles, and I got lucky. These are basically as big of rectangles as I could get out of these hexagon shapes, but it ended up being perfect for what I needed. During this part of the installation, I wanted to keep things simple. I knew I would need to eventually make custom cuts around all of my edges in the windowsill, but for now, I just avoided those pieces, and I just stuck to making this simple, straight corner cut. In fact, this is probably a good time to point out that a two-person tiling team is probably way more than twice as fast as one person doing this on their own, because one person can be a dedicated installer while the other can just full-time be measuring and cutting.
So far, our bottom row is looking great, and we're down to our last wall. I'm gonna cut down a full piece that's gonna go into the corner and match the other sheet of tiles. That way we get a really clean, mitered look once we get grout applied.
And also, conveniently, we are approaching another outlet, which is a great time to demonstrate kind of how to measure, mark, and cut this again. This time, my sheet lined up where I was going to make a really thin cut on the edge of one of my tiles. In hindsight, I think I should have put tape on the back of the tile too to prevent it from breaking in half like it did. Unfortunately though, it's just a really thin piece of tile, and this was probably inevitable either way. Plus, I realized this is getting covered by an outlet cover, otherwise I probably would have cut that away and cut a new little sliver. And now we've successfully installed our bottom row. And before I moved on, I cleaned up any extra thin set left on the wall. I also cleaned out all of my grout lines with this little specialty tool. This was the end of day 1 and we'll pick up on day 2.
And now it is time to take care of the edging before we install more tile. I want a piece right here where we're starting underneath the microwave. I'll also go ahead and pre-cut all my trim pieces around our edges.
Online in forums, you'll see a lot of tile installers say that they cut their trim literally on their wet saw. Now this does a great job, you just need to clean up your cut a little bit with sandpaper or a file. But it does have some safety concerns that we'll get to.
That's gonna fit great, and I'm happy to report we measured, cut, and installed the first row perfect so that a solid 2-row block gives us a perfect reveal with our trim. Awesome.
So now let's get back to cutting trim on the tile saw and why it's potentially dangerous. Essentially, it's a sliding table with a blade pulling the material into itself.
Huh, maybe I should switch to an angle grinder.
At the end of the day, I do not recommend cutting your trim like this because of the potential danger, but if you do feed it slow, it is safe.
Awesome! Glad we got that figured out.
And check out this test fit.
Oh, that's perfect. Super pro.
At the end of the day, if you're using power tools to cut your trim, I would recommend either using the diamond blade that you can cut tile with on an angle grinder or a metal cutting disc on the angle grinder. This kind of disc will be a little bit quicker and easier to use, but both will do. After you hit the trim with a sanding block, you can install it and it looks great. Just like with tile, you want to put a little bit of thin set down before you put your trim in, and then you can set it in place before your tile. You can do this immediately before you install tile, or you can put your trim in as your very, very first step before putting in any tile at all. If you're doing that, you're committing a little bit more to your measurements, but if you're confident in them, that's no problem. And you'll remember, I've got a ton of little triangle tile offcuts, so I utilized those here. Placing all of these little pieces ended up taking way longer than I expected, and if I was doing this again, I probably would have just cut down full sheets to size and saved the time. But it did end up looking good.
To measure my next piece, I'm gonna flip it compared to the orientation I actually want. Then I'll push it up against my cabinet and I'll mark right here the bottom of the point, including that 1/8 inch gap.
And this mark is where I'm gonna wanna cut it. I also wanna take into account the thickness of the blade, and I don't want it to exactly butt up against the cabinet. I want about an 1/8 inch gap there as well.
It's tough to get my trowel in here, so it's gonna be a little easier to back butter these tiles.
And you'll notice again that I didn't do this little complicated cut in the corner on the full sheet. I saved it and I made the cut on an individual piece.
And it's easy to mark, cut, and fit a single small tile. What we'll do is we'll put it in place, making the bottom match the rest of the tile. Then I'll mark where I want to cut across the tile, and then with the tile centered, I'll mark where I want to cut it widthwise, about right there.
Then I can basically connect those two dots and then cut it out on the wet saw. Remember that the level of precision here doesn't have to be crazy because there's going to be a little bit of a reveal between the cabinet and the tile that's going to get filled with grout or caulk. Alright, now that that's done, let's get back to finishing out this top row, moving left. If it's possible, try and back butter your tiles individually, but if your tiles are too small, don't worry about it. This will help prevent that thin set from getting into the grout lines a little bit. Backfilling the spaces between the tile sheets and the trim was a fun process because they were all simple straight cuts, and I utilized a lot of scrap tile that I had laying around. I did notice one benefit to applying the trim before any tile and letting it set would be that your trim can't move at all. And that would actually be pretty useful in some situations like where you're trying to make a tight miter in your trim, like on this corner here. I ultimately got great results, but it was a little tricky with the tiles pushing against the trim once I started putting in spacers. I repeated the same process on the other side, installing the trim and then backfilling it with tile. And I've got to say, it was way easier doing the complex cuts on the individual pieces rather than trying to cut it out of the full sheets while I was installing the base layer. And with our last edge complete, it looks like we're done.
Okay, not quite done. I still do have this section next to the fridge. The sun's going down on me outside, so the lighting's probably gonna get crappy as I install this, but I do wanna make sure it gets done today. That way we can grout starting tomorrow morning. But before we do that, I'd like to give a big thanks to the sponsor of today's episode, Squarespace. If you need a website, online store, or just a custom domain, Squarespace is your one-stop shop. And the best part is you need zero website building experience. And now, with Fluid Engine, Squarespace's next-generation website design platform, it's never been easier to unlock your unbreakable creativity. With features like their updated drag-and-drop technology on both desktop and mobile. Not to mention, there are no limits to the number of products that you can sell using a Squarespace store, whether that's a physical good, a digital good, or a service product. And if you're somebody that takes payments in person, Squarespace has got you covered. By connecting the Square card reader to the Squarespace app, all of your sales, orders, and inventory are up to date online and in person. So to learn more, make sure and go to squarespace.com/modernbuilds. Link is in my description, where you can build out your entire Squarespace site before entering any of your credit card info. And then once it's time to make your site live, don't forget to use my code ModernBuilds for 10% off your first site, store, or domain with Squarespace. As always, thanks a ton to Squarespace for sponsoring awesome DIY content, and you all for watching. Now let's get this backsplash finished. I am happy to report that our tile dried good, it's set, and it looks great. I've already done quite a bit of cleaning up though. First, I used a wet rag just to clean up as much thin set off of the face of the tiles as possible. And then I used a grout removing attachment for my multi-tool to get in those grout lines and remove the thin set adhesive. This is really convenient for non-square tiles. You can also use a manual grout saw like this one too. I could also take down our MDF ledge where our stove is going. I'm using sanded grout, which is useful for 1/8 inch to 1/2 inch grout lines. Anything smaller or larger, you'll want non-sanded grout, but that's more expensive. And if you're curious, the color that I'm using is called platinum. It's a relatively light gray, but it should add quite a bit of contrast with these bright white tiles we've got.
Mixing grout is simple, just make sure that it's really stiff. That way it holds its shape because you don't want it to move once it's in the grout line.
So I'm gonna start by getting my grout into all of the joints. I wanna press it in, and I also wanna work in multiple directions.
I also prioritize getting the top and the edges first.
And now that my top is covered, what I'm gonna do is start from the bottom, and with decent pressure, just work all the way up.
This is gonna flood our grout lines and fill any negative spots.
You can see how much that just did. And now what I'm gonna do, in an X pattern, is just make sure I'm getting things seated in all of my diagonal joints.
We're just gonna squeegee the tile faces clean.
And you don't wanna overwork it. You just wanna make sure that everything's packed in and there's no voids behind the face of your grout. And now we can move on to the next section.
The goal is to get the grout seated, obviously, but then remove as much of the grout off of the face of the tiles as possible. The tiles I chose have that handmade look, which means they don't have a perfectly flat face. That made this task a little bit more tricky, but not too tough.
This is a good size section for me to now switch to cleaning things up with a sponge. I've got a pretty large backsplash and I'm not the fastest at grouting, but the goal is to let your grout set for about 5 or 10 minutes and then come back to get as much of this grout off the face of the tiles and to smooth out all of your grout joints. You want a sponge that's wet, but it's not dripping. You'll just work kind of side to side and in circles, and you'll notice how moving in different directions helps blend different grout lines.
And it's just important to remember this is a gradual process.
And I'm basically using 0 pressure the whole time, a feather touch.
Each time we come back with the sponge, we'll be getting a certain amount of the grout off of the face of the tile, and then we'll rinse that sponge out.
I've got 1 bucket for clean water and then 1 bucket for dirty. And when I clean this off, first I'll go into my dirty bucket just to get rid of the majority of the grout that's on the sponge and make sure to wring this water out as much as you can. Then I'll take it to my clean water and load my sponge up, making sure there's not enough water that is dripping. I'd say remember that this is a gradual process. It's gonna take multiple sponge rinses before you get all of this cleaned up.
Oh, and I'll make sure and leave links to all the tools, materials, and supplies below.
And now the goal is to have as dry of a sponge as I can get. And you can see it starting to pick it up off the face of the tile. And just remember, you're not going for perfect here. What we want is to get our grout lines looking nice. If you've got a little bit of a haze, don't worry about it too much. We'll come back to fix that.
And this was a good stopping point for me, so I moved back to applying grout. Just like before, I wanted to really flood these grout lines. I prioritized the edges first, making sure that I got a good edge around all of my trim and the cabinets. Then I worked with my grout float from the bottom to the top, making sure that I really seeded that grout into the spaces. I mean, this corner was tough to get into, but that was the general game plan. Then I came back with my sponge, just like before, and I did multiple passes to get as much of the grout as I could off the face of these tiles.
And now it's time to go back and get any remaining haze with a microfiber rag or cheesecloth.
Just from wiping for a second, you can see how much grout is coming off of the face of these tiles. Now, I wasn't able to remove 100% of the haze by doing this, but it did take care of almost 90% of it, I would say. And last but not least, I just took care of this small section next to where the fridge is gonna go. Same steps as before, and our grout is now complete. I let this cure overnight before we could move on to our next steps.
Everything is cured and it looks great. I did notice that I had a little bit of haze on the surface of my tiles. So I used this grout haze remover to take care of it. This is gonna be more likely on a contrasty grout and tile combination like what we have, but it's an awesome product and it also helps clean up any haze from countertops as well. And now that that's done, I'm gonna go back with a grout and tile sealer to seal the grout and tile. Go figure. I'll apply a pretty heavy coat and let that soak into the tile for about 5 minutes and then wipe away any excess before it's able to dry on the surface of the tile. You do not want that. And you can do a couple of coats depending on how porous your tile and grout is.
And I don't remember it saying on the directions that a roller can be used, but a foam roller was really convenient for applying this sealer. As one of my final steps, I applied some siliconized sanded grout, which is basically caulk for backsplash. I used it between the countertops and the backsplash, even though there was a little bit of grout in between the tile and the counter already. I just wanted to make sure there was a good waterproof joint here and it wouldn't crack later on. When reinstalling outlets or switches, you can use these spacers to offset them so that they're flush with the face of the tile instead of the electrical box. And with that, our backsplash is done. So there you have it. I am really happy with the look that we got out of this. It's not too modern and it's not too traditional. I think somebody that's on either end of the style spectrum will like this look that we're going for in the kitchen. Here's a couple shots to remind you what the kitchen looked like before we got this backsplash in. And like I said, I'm just really happy with the improvements we made.
And now it's time for the price breakdown. I spent about $300 on the tile and about another $100 on miscellaneous items like thin set, grout, spacers, and all of that. And I'm not including the price of the tile saw in this. It was about $350 with the stand, but I'm considering that a tool investment. Around here in Oklahoma City, I would expect somebody to charge me about $1,000, maybe $1,200 plus the price of materials to install a backsplash like this. So I would say our time and labor was well worth it. Make sure and check out the full playlist of all of these renovation videos, and we'll see you next time on Mike's First Flip.
It's Mike's First Flip.
See you next time. Bye.